Well, now that we recognize that communication is an attempt to transmit meaning through the use of symbols, the question becomes, how exactly does that process occur between a couple individuals? What does it mean to us organizationally to begin to wonder about meaning being transmitted within our organization? And what happens when our organization crosses borders? So when we begin to think internationally, could there be differences that arise from cultural differences that intrude upon this communication process, i.e., can cultural differences actually create noise in the communication process? So let's take a look at this, and we'll start by taking a look specifically at a communication process itself. Now, when we look at the communication process, as you can see, we have a couple players here, a sender and a receiver of information or meaning, and then we can think of that as one-way communication. It goes in one transmission from sender to receiver. And then we can think of two-way communication where that original receiver gets the meaning, decides to respond, so has to re-encode the new meaning in symbol and send it back to the original sender, who's now a receiver. And so we've got this circle of meaning going from one party to another, re-encoded and sent back in another form to complete that circle. It happens in terms of coding meaning in symbols first of all, and then a choice of a channel or a mechanism by which to send that meaning. And so our communication process becomes the identification of meaning, coding it into symbols, sending it along some predetermined channel so it can be received and decoded to get the message that's being sent. The problem for us is that when that occurs, there can be things that intrude upon the meaning getting from one party to another. That's noise. It also can be the fact that while there may not be any noise, we may choose a channel that doesn't allow us to give up as much information, as much meaning in the communication transmission as we want. And we'll see that as a concept known as richness in just a little bit. So if that's the process that we generally take, managerially, it becomes important to us because this communication process allows us to do a lot of things. First of all, it helps us with a control function because it is communication that allows us to get data and information with regard to what we're trying to do and what we've actually done throughout the process. Okay? It can be formal directive of what to do, formal report of how we've done, could be informal check-ins as well. And that informal check-in sometimes can help leaders with their motivational aspects as well. Motivation is this idea of building goal-directed behavior. And so to the extent we can give people ideas of what they should be doing, some status checks on how they're doing, that lends itself to goal-setting theory and motivation. Communication helps us from a cultural standpoint because we need to be able to express things about what we're doing, so it can help us express emotion sometimes from a leadership or a cultural aspect. And then finally, it is the lifeblood of decision making. I have to have data to make a decision. The only way I get data is from information housed somewhere either inside or outside the organization. I need to have a communication process that allows the meaning of that data, one, to be received by me, two, then to be transmitted back to other decision makers or those that are going to implement the decision. So communication really is getting all the information we need organizationally to fulfill our functions from and to the people that either have to respond to it or deal with it. Now, this idea of channel choice comes into play because there's different ways we can communicate. As we talked about in class, we can use words, we can speak to one another, and we can hear. But tonality matters. Accent sometimes can get in the way. It's quick. I can respond to you right away because you're speaking to me and I can respond right away. But there are some dangers to this because we can misinterpret words, we can hear things differently, and we can respond perhaps too quickly sometimes. Sometimes we can slow the process down by engaging in written communication. That's a channel as opposed to verbal communication. Good news is, I have a record of what we communicated. It's written down and can be stored. Bad news is it may slow down the process. So with these types of channel choices to transmit meanings, there are usually pros and cons, and it kind of depends upon the nature of the transmission. What is the meaning you're trying to get across, and does it lend itself to one approach or another? You guys are much more comfortable with electronic communication than most, but we recognize one of the great downfalls of electronic communication is it's almost too easy. We get bombarded with emails, with text messages, and so it's the classic informational overloads environment. And so we can see that these different approaches lend a little bit or more or less meaning to the transmission. And this is a concept known as richness. How much meaning can we get across in any given communication episode? And in this diagram here from Daft and Marsick, you can see kind of a layout that different communication channels are more appropriate for certain messaging simply because they add things to the message. If it's just a standard update, a monthly update, newsletters, memos, standard publications in text form usually suffice because it's repetitive. We know what it's going to be about. We can get what meaning we want. It's there. We can go back and get it. But it's usually not critical information that we need for day-to-day activities. So kind of an archival presentation, a written form, makes some sense. If we need something done right away and we need people to truly understand the import of it, that may argue more for a face-to-face conversation, which is at the top end of this pyramid from Daft and Marsick. The top end of the pyramid suggests that this is the richest form of communication. Again, richness, how much meaning in any one communication episode. Face-to-face allows us to bring a lot more meaning to the communication because it allows us to deliver nonverbal movements, actions, dress, language, context, all kinds of different things that can pack more meaning into the receiver's sense of what we're trying to transmit. So it can be the pounding of the table to make a point. It can be the smile that lets people know you're happy with something. It can be the formal boardroom that projects an image of power as you're making your speech. So this idea of richness suggests that we can choose for very important messages a face-to-face vehicle or channel as opposed to written just to get that much more packed in. And so I think Daft and Marsick's pyramid does a nice job of suggesting that depending upon how important, if you will, meaning is in the transmission, we have an opportunity to choose the most effective way to deliver that. Now, that begins to feed us into the organizational issue here because leaders, managers, workers all need to figure out what's the best way to communicate the information that either is required of them or to get the information they need to go forward. And this harkens back to Miles and Snow's work on their topology, where we looked at the idea that once a firm has chosen a strategy, their entrepreneurial question, they need to find ways to structure that and put it in place so that they can deliver on their pursuit of their competitive advantage. And that was Miles and Snow's engineering problem. How are we going to put this together? Communication is one of the critical issues that begins to feed the structure in its attempt to deliver on our strategy. And so as we talked about, if we're thinking of a vertical structure, we're interested in information and meaning going up and down a hierarchical system. And as you can see in this chart here, we can think of informational structures that lend themselves more to information going up, upward communication, or down, downward communication, either of which is probably appropriate for a vertical hierarchical structure, depending upon the objectives. On the other hand, you can see a key word in the depiction in this diagram of coordination as part of horizontal communication. Because recall, if we are a prospector, we're in multiple markets trying to move quickly, that means we need to distribute decision making. If we're going to distribute decision makers on a broader basis, we have to make sure we have some way to communicate necessary meaning and data to them to support their decision making. And that suggests the ability to communicate across levels. So now we've got a situation where we understand interpersonal communication, and we're going to lay on top of that an organizational imperative to ensure that the structures we put in place to communicate interpersonally within our organization must also fit with our need to move information and meaning appropriately throughout the organization. Organizational process of communication, critical to our development of activities and decision making in support of our strategy. Now, when we start to do this, we're going to see that certain people like to communicate in different ways, particularly verbally. And this is going to lead us into the second problem for us, not just how to set up an organizational structure, but how to accommodate personal and or cultural differences in that communication process, one of which is verbal styles. We all have different verbal styles. Some of us are very direct. We focus on the outcome of our communication episode. Some are a little less direct, more indirect. We'll speak a little bit more about things not directly related to the outcome, but frame it in the context of that desired outcome. Some are very elaborate. I got to use all the words I can. Some of us are much more succinct. I actually try and use the fewest words that I can. And maybe in the middle we can think of people who are described as exacting in their conversation. They focus on using the right words the right way. Context matters to some, right? Information that surrounds communication episodes. We'll see that culturally, context matters more for some cultures than others. But it suggests that in a communication episode, it's not just the verbal style, it's that which surrounds the use of the verbal style. And then finally, affectation. Higher nonverbal, higher facial expression, higher body movements, higher broad strokes around the discussion, where we hold it, what the setting looks like, who's in the room even if they're not speaking, as opposed to an instrumental approach. Instrumental suggests directed at an outcome. And so we're going to not worry about context as much, but try and get to the point. So that's a nice cascading of verbal styles. And you can see in chart 7.2 that some countries prefer different verbal or communication styles. Australia, Canada, the United States, very direct, very exacting, personal in terms of how they describe it, and instrumental, directed at the outcome. In Egypt, we're going to find something different. We're very indirect, high context in terms of that conversation, much more wordy because there's an elaborateness to paint a broad and bright picture. And the idea is not as the idea of the outcome is not as instrumental. It's a little bit more effective. So again, we can use words, we can use writing. Different cultures will expect them to be delivered in different ways or to have different types of content attached to them. And that means, therefore, that the communication process in the multiple countries that we deal in are going to have to be able to accommodate the styles of their managers. So again, Australia direct, Egypt indirect. For Australia, again, it could be very personal. For Egypt, very contextual, just as it would be for Korea and Saudi Arabia. It suggests, therefore, that if we're going to have locations in countries that are low context and high context, it might mean that those countries are going to prefer much higher nonverbals, the contextual, and we're going to have to make sure we have some way to accommodate their need to have more face-to-face meetings than non-face-to-face meetings. That's expensive if we want to travel back and forth and probably impractical, but it suggests technologically our communication process may rely more on video conferencing than teleconferencing to allow more context into the process. And we'll see that play out as well because we can measure countries in terms of their need for context and conversation. Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, communication in Arab countries are always very, very high context. The place within the meeting, within which the meeting occurs, matters. The people invited or not invited give signals to what's going to be discussed. When we dispense with informal and personal talk to get to business talk varies country to country. In the United States, there may be very little person-to-person talk until after the outcome of the conversation. It's going to be just the opposite in a Japanese culture, and that discussion is likely to be met with some formal ceremony that precedes it. Some countries would prefer to have an exchange of gifts before we engage in certain conversations. Other countries, it's not even part of the conversation. And so again, to the extent we're going to be operating in multiple countries, we recognize that the same thing is going on interpersonally. We're coding up messages and symbols and transmitting the meaning. But the setting within which and the way that transmission is going to be interpreted is going to vary greatly country to country, suggesting our need to understand how those countries differ, to develop a structure that allows for communication to be made within those expectations, and also have a coordinating mechanism that links multiple communication styles in our multinational corporation back to a coordinated and cohesive outcome. If we look back to Miles and Snow's approach, If our strategy is to engage in multiple countries to create our competitive advantage, we need to find a way to allow people to communicate the very meaning upon which that outcome depends.